All right, it's been a minute here, but let's do this. Chapter 17, going to talk about um, Darwin and real evolution, and then the racist social Darwinism and its various manifestations. Um, I got a slide on art, nothing really special there. And then dudes doing dude things and women doing women things, and that's it. A little on Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Booker T. Washington. So let's do it. Um, Darwin. There he is. 1859 is the origin of species. So if you'll recall, that's before the Civil War. That's a long time ago. Descent of Man, 1871. It's a big deal. Obviously, Darwin is a big deal for us in the modern age. Darwin is considered one of the big three of this time period. Marx, Freud, Darwin. Often there's history of science or philosophy classes at the college level that just look at Marx, Freud, Darwin. Sometimes it's Marx, Freud, Darwin, and Douglas, Frederick Douglass. The reason for that is Marx disrupted what was everything that was assumed to be natural about class hierarchy. Freud disrupted everything that was thought to be normal or natural about the way our minds work and the way we think. And then Darwin, of course, disrupted religion and the why we are what we are biologically speaking. Obviously, Frederick Douglass with issues of race is also. Can fit in there. So anyway, all that to say, in the 19th century, people read this stuff. You might not be hip to the latest scientific stuff coming out, but back then Americans read. They read a lot, right? And this is a product of the Industrial Revolution, cheaper printing. So there's lots of trashy stuff one can read. But they also read science because this is like really fascinating, right? Like the science that's coming out is upending everything people thought to be true about human beings, about religion, about all kinds of stuff. So Americans read it. As I've said, religious Americans not too keen on it, but really at first they kind of underestimate Darwin. I mean, as your book talks about paleontologists and all this kind of stuff, there's all kinds of kooks coming up with science, right? This is before the era of boundary making, where what is it? What do you need to do to become a biologist or a paleontologist or a chemist or whatever. If you have enough money and you can say you are one, and then you just do it. So a lot of people have done this, and their findings kind of they get disproven, or someone else comes along. So a lot of folks at first just thought, oh, this Darwin guy, here comes another one. Oops. It turns out he actually got it right. So that's a game changer. Interestingly, this is not in the book, but it is true. Um, Darwin was actually very important for early feminism. The reason being is perhaps obvious that one of the main justifications for women being subservient to men was found in the Bible, right? It's the Word of God. Who are you to say that you shouldn't be subservient to men? And, the story of Adam and Eve and original sin, all that kind of stuff. Um, with Darwin, suddenly that's all out the window, right? If that story is not true, then maybe this whole patriarchy thing. So Darwin is very important for early feminism. And then obviously because racists are stupid in any given moment in history, um, uh, uh, always, they misread Darwin, and famously or infamously, the most famous misreading being social Darwinism. So let's get into that. Um, I love this image in the background. It's actually a French image satirizing the difference between barbarism and civilization. Of course, it's who is doing the killing. So 19th century pseudoscience, there's a lot of it. I don't know if our book's going to get into phrenology and polygenist evolutionary theory and all kinds of kooky stuff. But the big one is obviously social Darwinism. It's a pseudoscience. It's not a real science, and it takes Darwin's ideas and misapplies them. So, social Darwinism. This is the idea that, like, right, survival of the fittest, right? That is the famous phrase that we associate with social Darwinism, not with Darwin. This is actually interesting because it's not Darwin that said it, it's Herbert Spencer, as I mentioned. However, the term is so popular, it kind of takes fire because it taps into the racist or the prejudices of the time period. That Darwin actually goes back in, and in the second edition of Origin of Species, he includes that kind of language of survival of the fittest. Why is it wrong? Nothing wrong with biology. Nothing wrong with looking at natural selection in the biological sense. But what it does is it takes that biological understanding of evolution or of natural selection and then applies it or misapplies it to culture, economy, society. Culture, economy, society, that's not biology, right? So talking about natural selection in a biological way is one thing. Then taking that and applying it to culture, to economy, to these things that are, made up by human beings, just doesn't work. Doesn't mean it's not really popular. And it's really popular largely because it explains and it's used to explain the various inequalities of the time period. Why does England have all of this industry? Why does North America have all these railroads and, banking and finance, and other parts of the world don't have it? Survival of the fittest. So obviously what Spencer is doing here is he's taking evolution and he's applying it to capitalism, right? So saying that, like, oh, the free market is just like the process of natural selection in the biological world. The interesting thing, as I have here for what it's worth, is that Darwin already did that. He already applied capitalism to evolution insofar as, steeped as he was in 19th century English political economy, a lot of the stuff that he sees in the natural world is him projecting what he understands about political economy into the natural world. So, competition, thrift, um, uh, uh, um, all of the stuff that economy. There's a lot of language in The Origin of Species that really is an imagery that's right out of English political economy. So this is an early criticism of Darwin's. So he did it. Spencer double does it. And that's where we get social Darwinism. Okay, another pseudoscience that we should talk about is eugenics. So as social Darwinism is the misapplication of biology to human populations, eugenics is the misapplication of genetics to human populations, right? Eugenics being beautiful genes, right? In the Greek, beautiful uh, genus, genus being genes. So this is the misapplication of genetics to human populations. And this is the idea that certain traits are inherent to certain races. So in the background here, you have this ridiculous 19th century image of, like, this is like different, human types, and they have different skulls. This is not a human, this is like a bird's skull or something here, but, like, okay, whatever. I mean, they're just making this stuff up anyway. They're just, like, this stuff wouldn't even, like, the worst student in your, like, bio class, that's like the scientists of the time period, they're worse than that, right? Because they're just, like, making stuff up, right? A lot of them aren't even going to the actual different parts of the world and observing. They're just reading books about other parts of the world and basing their findings on that. So the problem here is that people can be bred or culled, right, like animals, and that you can actually, like you can make a hybrid of a fruit or something. You can hybridize human beings if you blend different races in the right way, or you can kill off. And the idea being, right, inferior races shouldn't be reproducing, things like that. Obviously, this stuff peaks in Nazi Germany. All of the pseudoscience, Herbert Spencer, the social Darwinists, the geneticists, the eugenicists, the polygenists, the phrenologists, All of these people are basically either American or English, a little bit of French. By the 1930s, science has moved way beyond this. But what Nazi Germany does is they go back and they say, oh, see, this is the real science. All these new scientists now are, it's like someone now saying, oh, it's political correctness. Political correctness is the reason why blah, 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 some dumb thing, right? So this is what's happening in the 1930s. The Nazis are saying this stuff is the real science. It proves our agenda. Doesn't end up well. Okay. The other issue here is that these pseudosciences view these other societies, these quote unquote primitive societies, as kind of contemporary examples of a prior age. So it proves evolution in a way that you can go to, sub-Saharan Africa or Papua New Guinea or someplace else and see people living in a way that is quote unquote primitive. And it kind of proves the superiority of the more developed societies, right? Like England, North America. So it kind of raises the question, who is writing this history? This is what we would call a teleological view of history, that there is a teleological, like telos, meaning like an end point, like a telescope, you look to the end. A teleological reading of history says that like things just get better and better, and like utopias at the end. So this, of course, raises the question of, uh, um, you know, who's telling the story? Whose telos are we talking about here? And it's generally European or North American projections. Okay. I'm not going to get into the art too much. I just use this as an excuse to show you this Cubies, some images from the Cubies. This is a children's ABC book that has a quite complicated rhyme structure to it that we read to our son. And it's based on the 1913 Armory show, which is mentioned in the book, where American audiences get their first taste of modern art. Yeah, realism is fine. The book mentions realism, but it doesn't really matter. What matters in this time period is modernism, and that's because it is thoroughly of this time period. It is rooted in industry, it is inspired by industry, by the geometry of cities, the hustle and bustle of urban life, the constant newness and change. There's actually another children's book that we have for our son is what's it? Copper Nickel Goes Mondrian or something. It's about the painter Mondrian and these artists or whatever. So he's always looking for the new. He wants something new, something new, something new. And that is the idea at the root of modern art. It's about the new, the most new, undiscovered thing. And that obviously you're not going to get that by painting the same old boring oil paintings as the Dutch masters, right? The book points out that this is a very kind of bro-y scene, as I point out, but that's nothing new. I don't know why we need to particularly call our attention to the fact that it's broy. The art world has always had art bros. I mean, Rembrandt was an art bro. So that's nothing new. What does matter is the sense that a lot of these bros who were making this kind of like, unabashedly kind of masculine views of the world, is that they were like doing it as a corrective to the effeminate, right, trends of modern society. And that matters because it relates to a larger crisis in masculinity that is happening in this time period. As someone who boxes, like this is not right. This is not how you do it. You get knocked out really quickly. But if anyone is interested in why all these old timey fisticuffs boxers pose like this, they didn't wear gloves. So it's all bare knuckle boxing, which means that you're not really trying to hit someone in the head too much, because it's going to do too much damage to your fist. So because it's mostly body shots, you want to keep your opponent further away from you, right, like that, and you're swinging low anyway. So that's, if you've ever wondered why these old photos, these people have such preposterous stances, not actually guarding their head, where you get knocked out. That's why. So anyway, as I was saying, just like in the previous slide, these bros are making broy art because they want to not seem effete or effeminate. A lot of bro stuff is happening because of a certain crisis in masculinity, and I'll get into that in a second. First, I'll mention why all this is happening. People have more income, men and women, because women are also entering into the workforce, but I'll get into that in a second. And they're spending their money. They have more leisure time because they're not farmers anymore. They don't have to like wake up at 4 in the morning and go to bed at 5 in the afternoon. So they can do stuff. What are some of the things they do? Book mentions P.T. Barnum. Um, the A-Push books always gloss over P.T. Barnum, and so does the movie, What the Great Entertainer or whatever. He got his start with freak shows, quote unquote. So like people with microcephaly, like small heads, bearded women, Siamese twins, the original Siamese twins or conjoined twins, actually being from Siam. Chang and Eng bunker. So anyway, that's where he gets his start. He also had a very, very old black woman that he had on display, alive, who he claimed was George Washington's nanny, and being however old she was. So that was one of his kind of early money makers. And when the old woman died, he sold tickets to a public autopsy of her body. So P.T. Barnum, yeah, circuses, but also not cool, man. Like you're weirdo, dude. Like that's like not cool stuff. Anyway, people go right to the circus. They go to these freak shows, whatever. They got extra money. Football is mentioned. This is mostly college football, and it's mostly what Ivy League stuff. This is camaraderie. It's muscular. This is like men always wanting to like Teddy Roosevelt. We'll learn about. It's all about this like being like a strong muscular man, and that again is because of a larger crisis in masculinity. I'll talk about that in a second. I'm getting to it. Mostly, so we're not doing like this is not the NFL. Baseball is another one, very important. Again, free money, leisure time. Baseball games are exclusively male spaces. There's hardly any women going to these spaces, and that's true up until like the 50s, 1950s. Baseball is also important because it's considered by many historians why it's so central to American history, and it's different now. We got all kinds of different sports, but back then and up until fairly recently, the idea was that if you knew baseball, if you knew who was pitching well, who was hitting well, who wasn't, right? You could talk to anyone. So it didn't matter if you're a millionaire or a union line worker. If you knew baseball and you knew stats and you knew what the game, you didn't have to play it, but like if you could talk it, then you could talk. Right. So that was a kind of democratic leveler. Knowledge of baseball was something that could bring people, men primarily, around, a table and, have a debate, have an argument, have a laugh about the sport. So that's why baseball, if you've ever wondered why is baseball so like is central to American history or American lore, that's why, because it's fundamentally a democratic sport. And, theoretically, that's true today, although we live, more kind of segregated lives in terms of class status. Boxing, the fisticuffs, also very popular sport. Not to like box, but to watch boxing matches, and everyone has their favorites. Boxing is, you might think, a violent sport, not as violent as MMA maybe, but like still much less violent than earlier leisure activities like dog fighting or bear or bull baiting, which was you get a bear or a bull and you tie it like tie it to a tree and you have dogs attack it, and then you place bets on, I guess, how long the dogs last or how long the bear lasts or the over under. I don't know, but like pretty bad stuff. So by comparison, boxing is tame. It's downright civilized, right? So there's another one, and then what I've been alluding to with the crisis of masculinity, I think sometimes people get this misconception when they hear gender. When someone says gender, they think it's something that like women have and men don't. Remember, gender is a socially constructed role. It's not like biological sex. It's something that is socially constructed. How you carry yourself, how you talk, the things you're interested in. You know, people apologize if they go, "Oh, she's so cute," and I go, "Oh, you know, Gus say, oh, I'm so sorry." They find out my son's. It's like you don't care, like barely speaks English. Like, what are you tripping out about, man? But it shows you how how wedded people are to these notions of gender roles. Well, this is a time period where gender roles for men are changing. You're not like the yeoman farmer, like, you know, who your entire family is reliant on you and your work and your knowledge of the seasons and the almanac and the crops or whatever. And you work hard and you can build houses and plow the fields and whatever. That's like a man, right? That is a man in the early 19th century understanding of a man, right? Independent farmer, labors with their hands, does all kinds of things, works hard, big family, all that. We're losing that in the late 19th century. Guys put on suits and like go sit at a desk and like, you know, copy things with a pen. Like like that's not masculine, right? So that this is the understanding. Like, I don't like this. There's something wrong about, yeah, I'm getting paid, but there's also like a guy telling me what to do, which makes me feel uncomfortable, makes me feel like, you know, effeminate or whatever, taking orders from a man. So what we get is this whole litany of things where we have these spaces emerge where men can be men, right? Football, baseball, boxing, all these different activities that men engage in terms of spectatorship. So it's not like people are playing football or like boxing each other, but the spectatorship, it's dudes together, right? Laughing, hanging out. Like there's a what we call a homosocial space, right? So not homoerotic, but homosocial in the sense that like it's a bunch of dudes, you know, locker room talk, right? 19th century version. And then they go to the YMCA, you know, get your swole on, whatever. That's not really super important. Okay, what are women doing? Um, Women are also experiencing changes in the way that they are socialized in their gender roles. Some of these are ongoing. We've seen this before. Temperance, we've seen this. There's not really a period in American history, really from the turn of the 18th to the 19th century on, where we haven't seen upper middle class white women wanting temperance. So that's ongoing until we get a constitutional amendment. Suffrage has also been ongoing. Remember, Seneca Falls, 1848, kind of kicks off what we call first wave feminism. This is women demanding a right to vote in more prominent roles in the public sphere, not necessarily jobs yet, but at least voting. And they start to get it. So, as this image in the background here indicates, this is a poster, pro suffrage poster, indicating that the first states to allow women to vote, because it's a statewide thing, eventually becomes a federal thing. But it starts in the West. And just like in the 1820s, if we think back to the Jacksonian period, Western states of that time period, Illinois, Iowa, Wisconsin, Western states want settlers to come west and settle. So they take away property requirements for voting, so poor people can vote. Poor people flood out west. Similar thing happens in this now. What we now understand is the West, right? The high desert, mountain West, and the West Coast. You want more people to immigrate. You just got a bunch of dudes like miners and things like that. Take away voting restrictions for women, and you're going to get families. So that's what happens, and then it does eventually go national, but not yet. Again, this is first wave feminism still. Not we won't get into the second wave feminism for quite some time. But there's new causes. There's a new kind of feminism, what is embodied by the Heterodoxy Club in New York. This is a more radical form of feminism, so it's way ahead of its time. Both gay and straight, women who were single, Very, very, very ahead of its time. So this isn't just women wanting temperance in the vote. This is women who are living in cities, living independent lives, who want, just like men are engaging in these homosocial spaces at football games or at boxing matches or whatever. The Heterodoxy Club was a homosocial space for women, where women could get, I mean, like women of a certain like radical bent, right, could get together and talk politics, whatever. And there wasn't discrimination based on, right, sexual orientation, all that kind of stuff. Um, and then Ida B. Wells, again, ahead of her time, is kind of singular for this time period. She is a black woman from the South writing about lynching, and really exposing it for what it actually is, just like straight up, unprovoked anti-black violence. So white Southerners like to say, oh, it was, this black person was threatening a white woman, or they were going to, commit sexual violence or whatever. No, it's all rumor, and it's all just straight anti-black violence, and it's really, really, really terrible. And Ida B. Wells exposes that. So she stands kind of alone in this time period as a strong voice for black civil rights as a woman, right? There's others we'll talk about now who are men, but in terms of women speaking up for the civil rights of black people in general, and women in particular, Ida B. Wells stands alone. Okay, these two. Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Let's do the highlights here. Du Bois wants full equality, so no half measures, right? College access, jobs, everything that white Americans should have or do have, black Americans should have. Period. Full stop. And he is considered a radical for this notion. Full civil rights. He believes in this notion of a talented tenth, that the 10% of the black population will kind of lead the other 90%, right? These are people who will, the first ones to get the college education, to move through the middle class, etc. Because of his radical views, he's around for a long time, because Joseph McCarthy in the 1940s starts targeting him as a communist, because, that equality, like equality, come on. Same thing with Martin Luther King, right? You're saying you want what? I'm sorry, equality? Sounds like communism to me. And more on that in a second. Booker T. Washington is more the accommodationist, right? He does not try to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson. He says we can be separate and equal. This is his understanding of education is vocational. Why do Black Americans need to learn, Latin and history, and read Shakespeare or whatever? White people want them to just do vocational jobs, mechanics, agricultural labor. Just go to mechanic school, go to ag school, and call it a day. You should be happy with that. So you see a very different understanding here. Of Du Bois versus Booker T. Washington. Famously, his Atlanta Compromise. In all things purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet as one as the hand, in all things essential to mutual progress. Obviously, if you're a white Southerner and you're pro segregation, which is almost all white Southerners, you like this message. You like Booker T. Washington's message a lot more than you like Du Bois's radical message. So, for the time period in the South, Booker T. Washington wins the day. Tuskegee Institute, if you've read Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, very, very good. One of the best novels in certainly in the 20th century. The headmaster at the beginning of the novel at the Institute is based on Booker T. Washington. Um, there's Booker T. Washington giving a speech to a white audience. Again, they love him because he's okay with segregation. And as I alluded, look, when Du Bois is asking for full equality, he's not doing it because he's a communist. He's doing it because he believes that African Americans are equal to white Americans. But later in his life, as you see here, he kind of makes the rounds in the left-leaning circles, like Mao here, having a good laugh, laughing about McCarthy maybe. And actually, he is at the end of his life, he moves to West Africa because he, like black radicals that we'll learn about in the 1960s and 70s, he just says, I can't, it's not going to happen. I've been fighting my whole life for equality in this country. It's not going to happen. Right. So I'm just going to move someplace where there's more black people. Um, that is period 7. And that is all for me. Not period 7. Excuse me. That is chapter 17, period 6. And that is all for me.